On behalf of the European Union Ambassador to the US, David O'Sullivan, I would like to welcome you to the EU delegation to the US for this EU rendezvous on the digital single market strategy, the state of play and the next steps. I think I know many of you in the room, but not all of you. So my name is Andrea Glorioso. I am the diplomatic counselor for the digital economy here in the US, in Washington, DC. I am an official of the European Commission, but I am based here in Washington, DC since a couple of years, I think, by now. So the purpose of this rendezvous, of this meeting today, is to guide you, is to share with you 1 year after the adoption of the digital single market strategy, where we stand, where we're going to, and we thought that more or less 12 months after the launch of the strategy, given the very high level of interest here in the US for what we're doing in Europe in this field, it would be a good moment to kind of assess where we stand, and also importantly, listen to your comments, remarks, concerns, constructive criticism, proposals that do not require a change in the treaties of the European Union. Those would be very much welcome as well. The way we're going to play this dance is that I'm going to give, I warn you, a rather longish presentation. So I beg your forgiveness in advance, but we thought it was better to just dump everything on you in one shot and then open the floor for a Q&A. You will receive a copy of the presentation. The reason why you haven't received it before is that I finished it 1 hour ago, so there simply wasn't the time to send it before, and you know how it is. I'm sure that all of you find yourselves in that situation. By the way, we apologize for this rather bizarre setup. We have had a technical problem yesterday with a big screen behind, so unfortunately we had to use this. I understand that people in the back might have some difficulties reading the slides, but A, you should be looking at me and listening to me and not looking at the slides, and B, we will distribute the slides anyway afterwards. I would also like to welcome those people who are connecting via the webcast. So you are all being video recorded, and there will be a video recording of this, so we are all on record for your information. I would like to thank very much the Internet Society New York chapter, Jolie McPhee, who is the gentleman back there, who is helping us with the web streaming. For those of you who are following the event remotely, you can tweet using the hashtag Digital Single Market. I know it's a long hashtag, but I discovered that the hashtag DSM is apparently used for all kinds of other conversations, which I really don't think we want to, or at least I don't want to get into. So unfortunately, we need to use a rather longish hashtag. Please send your questions via Twitter, and during the Q&A, my colleagues from the public press and diplomacy section will also take the microphone and ask me those questions. So without further ado, let's jump into the presentation. So I, again, need to ask your forgiveness because, yes, this is about the state of play of the digital single market strategy, but I strongly believe that in order to understand what the DSM strategy, I will say DSM from now on to try to save on time, in order to understand why we launched the DSM strategy, why the European Commission launched that, it's also important to understand where we're coming from, at least from a European Union perspective. I strongly believe after 2 years here in the US, I believe that a number of questions that I have received betray, with all due respect, sometimes a slight misunderstanding of our own history and institutional setup, which can answer some of those questions. Not all of them, but some. So in this slide, let me point out 2 articles. They're actually a mix of 2 articles. They're not the complete articles of our funding treaties. Now, our rule, I cannot use the word constitution because the European Union does not have a constitution, and we have plenty of discussion with our member states on that. But since we are here in the US, I do believe that you can think about these founding treaties, the Treaty of the European Union and the Treaty on the Function of the European Union, as equivalent to your constitution. They are our primary law, our basic law. And I would like to point out to 2 articles in those treaties. The first is Article 3 of the Treaty on the European Union. The Union shall establish an internal market. That's an obligation for us. It's not something that we can, as the European Commission, as the executive of the European Union, it's not something that we can decide whether we like to do it or not. It's one of our main obligations under the Treaty of the European Union. We also need to promote economic, social, and territorial cohesion, and we have to respect cultural and linguistic diversity. I believe this is important, in particular, for one of the packages that we recently adopted, the content and e-commerce package. It's important to keep this in mind. This is an obligation that comes to us through our primary law. And similarly, the Article 26 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union defines a little bit better what our obligation in terms of constructing a single market is. So the Union shall adopt measures with the aim of establishing or ensuring the functioning of the internal market, which shall comprise a market without internal frontiers, with which the free movement of goods, persons, services, and capital is ensured. Again, primary obligation for us. It comes from our founding treaties. And the interesting thing is that our work on the internal market or common market, whatever you want to call it, is not new. We already done this stuff. And in fact, back in the late 80s, the 90s, we launched a very ambitious initiative to complete the internal market. Because one thing is the obligation you get from the founding treaties, another thing is how you implement them. And back in the late 80s, early 90s, we realized at the European Commission that we were not doing enough to actually have a single market, an internal market. I'm mentioning this just to point out, again, this is not new for us. Working on the internal market is one of our primary obligations. We've been doing it for a long time at the European Commission. Interestingly enough, and without going into too much detail now, I can say that I was not there at the time. I think I was in high school or even in primary school, secondary school. But anyway, I'm told that a lot of the criticism and concerns that have been raised towards the digital single market, in particular, I must say from the US, echo very much the same kind of criticism and concern that were raised back at the time. And yet, apparently, we managed to do something that made almost everybody happy back at the time, so we have a reason to believe that we wouldn't be able to do it this time around. Another piece of context that I want to give you are the so-called political guidelines of the European Commission 2014-2018, which is the current mandate of this European Commission, presided by the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, who, as some of you might know, was the former Finance Minister and then Prime Minister of Luxembourg. These political guidelines identify what are the political objectives of this Commission. They come from the top and they color, influence, and drive and direct all the work of every single official of the European Commission, myself included, obviously. These political guidelines were presented to the Council of the European Union, the Member States, and to the European Parliament as a kind of political program in order for the President, for Jean-Claude Juncker, who was President-elect at the time, to be actually appointed President. It's a political contract between the President, between the European Commission, and other EU institutions. So you can read that, for those of you who are close enough, you can read that, some passages. I think that one passage that I want to mention of these political guidelines is that in the words of President Juncker, he and we believe that we must make much better use of the opportunities offered by digital technologies. We had to have the courage, and it does require political courage, to break down national silos. That's something that at the Commission we have been doing for a very long time, and we know how difficult it is, believe me. But still, that's the direction we get from the top levels of our own institution. And clearly, this breaking down of silos should go. All right. Okay, so what we're going to do. Yeah, so we'll start now. No, I cannot postpone it.
So if you just pull it down in the corner and they go out of the picture.
Yes, but it will restart. The computer will restart. So in the next 14 minutes, the computer will start. Just be aware of that. Sorry about that. I won't make it in 14 minutes. But so clearly, together with the breaking down of silos, we also have to boost the digital skills. And that's very important for me personally, something I've been maintaining as soon as I joined the European Commission. Digital policies in the digital single market has to become a horizontal policy. It has to touch across all different sectors of our work, political work and policy work at the Commission, but also policy work of all the other EU institutions. So long story short, on May the 6th, 2015, and some of you might remember that the delegation here organized an event to present the adoption of the digital single market strategy. All of you will have learned it by heart, I'm sure. It's publicly available online. That's a strategic document. So it's a kind of shortest document for the standards of the European Commission, which sets down the objectives, which are pretty simple at the end of the day, which is breaking down the national barriers that still exist in the digital market in the European Union through 16 actions. What we have been doing since May 2015, today, and we will until today, and we will continue doing, is implement those strategic outlook, those 16 actions, through legislative and non-legislative proposals. And I will go through the main highlights of those proposals. That's the idea of today. But again, I wanted you to have the context of where we are coming from, because without that, I believe that you can't really understand why we are making certain choices and the kind of obstacles also that we're going to face, even internally in the European Union, to be completely honest. Now, very briefly, the digital single market strategy is based on three. Those of you who have followed the work of the European Commission will know that we like the word pillars. We have pillars everywhere. I never understood why, but anyway, the DSM is based on three pillars, surprise. The first pillar is helping to make the EU digital world a seamless and level marketplace to buy and sell. This is really about e-commerce. It's about removing unjustified geo-blocking. It's about modernizing our e-commerce rules, including consumer protection and business-to-business transactions. The second pillar is about designing rules that match the pace of technology and support infrastructure development, because clearly it's no use to have rules for e-commerce that work if the infrastructure is lagging behind. And this is about making sure our telecommunication rules, our audiovisual rules, our approach to internet intermediaries and online platforms, and our approach to the horizontal level of trust and security that we had to have across the board is up to speed for the 21st century. The third pillar is about making sure that the European economy, industry, the labor market, across all sectors, not only the tech sectors, but across the board, can actually make use of the opportunities that are offered by the digital economy. Actually, and I'm not sure I should say that because it's in my job title, I'm the counselor for the digital economy, but I'm myself very doubtful of using the term digital economy because I think that nowadays it's very difficult to distinguish what's the digital economy from what's the, I don't know, traditional economy, physical economy, non-digital economy. Things have become so intertwined that it's really difficult to put a clear wall between these two issues. But it's in my job title, so I need to continue using the term digital economy. Now, very briefly, I just want to point out how the European Commission is organized about this. Now, this is an organigram of the European Commission. It's very small. You can read the names. Don't worry. I need to memorize all the 28 commissioners' names. You don't. But basically, up immediately under the President of the European Commission, who has the primary responsibility, political responsibility for the activities of the Commission, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I believe, 6 or 7 vice presidents. Each of those vice presidents has responsibility for a particular project, flagship project. The DSM, the Digital Single Market, is one of those projects. And the vice president in charge of the overall coordination and who has political responsibility for the overall coordination of the DSM is Vice President Andrus Ansip, who has already visited the US a number of times. As you might know, he used to be the Prime Minister of Estonia, which is, according to the numbers we see, probably one of the most digitally advanced member states of the EU. And Vice President Ansip coordinates a team, a rather largish team of commissioners across all different sectors. So there are commissioners who are responsible for specifically for digital economy and society. That's the case of Commissioner Oettinger, who also visited the US. But then you have commissioners who are responsible for the social dialogue, for economic and financial markets, for taxation, etc. This is a recognition of the fact that what we're doing in the DSM, what we're doing in the digital economy touches upon many, many, many different fields. So there is a need for this level of coordination in the European Commission, which I can say, and I've been in the Commission almost 10 years by now, it's working surprisingly well. Nobody would have thought that when this setup, which is a new setup in this Commission, was proposed. Everybody was saying, oh, it's impossible, commissioners will not work with each other, etc. It is actually working pretty well at the end of the day. We're still a bureaucracy, so there are limits, but... Now, one thing that, before we really jump into the substance, again for context, one thing that I really want all of you to keep in mind, and I apologize because probably many of you are fully aware of this, but I think there might be a fair number who are not. At the end of the day, the European Commission, which is the institution that I work for, is kind of the executive of the European Union. We propose the legislation, we monitor the implementation of the legislation, we make sure that member states abide to their obligations under the treaties, including the correct transposition and implementation of the legislation. But we are not the legislators. When we make a legislative proposal, and I will describe a few of them in the next slides, that proposal goes to the European Parliament, the directly elected representatives of European citizens, and the Council of the European Union, which represent the 28 member states. Those two are what we call our co-legislators, and it's those two institutions that at the end of the day, together with the Commission, have to negotiate on whatever comes out and becomes EU legislation. This is not, it's not because we don't want as the European Commission to take our responsibilities, but people have to be very clear that we cannot simply wake up in the morning and say, well, this is the directive, now everybody just implements it. There is a negotiating process which involves other EU institutions. All these two, there are also other EU institutions, but I wanted to simplify the scheme here. Those two main, the two main co-legislators, the Council and the European Parliament, has already expressed, I would say, very strong political support for the digital single market, for the objectives of the DSM. We will see how things go as we negotiate the specific legislative proposal that we have put forward. And some of those negotiations are already taking place. Now, in terms of timeline, the one information I want to share with you right now is that we launched the DSM strategy, we announced the DSM strategy in May 2015. And we did say at the time that we would make all the legislative proposals, including in those 16 actions, which I mentioned before, and not all those 16 actions are strictly legislative in nature. Some of them do not involve actual legislation, but a few of them do. We committed as the European Commission that we would put on the table the proposals for those legislative initiatives by the end of 2016, which is exactly what we're doing. Again, allow me to go back to this. What we can do as the European Commission is to put forward the proposals by the end of 2016, which, believe me, is not easy because there are complex matters and they require a lot of consultation, as it should be. That doesn't mean, because I heard this quite often, especially in business circles here in the US, we cannot control, as the European Commission, we cannot control how long the negotiations on those proposals will actually take. We do have a political commitment by both the Council, i.e. the Member States, and the European Parliament, that they would accelerate negotiations on our proposals as much as possible. But that doesn't mean that we can commit on closing all the negotiations on all the legislative initiatives that we're launching by the end of 2016. That is not something we ever committed on, and I want to be very clear on this. Now, after we adopted the DSM in May 2015, what we did was launching a very ambitious process of public consultation. We consulted on everything under the sun, including, I believe, at a certain point on the meaning of life or something. I missed that, but I'm sure that there was a consultation on that as well. More seriously, every single topic which we announced under the DSM strategy has been the subject of at least a public consultation, in several cases a public consultation plus further assessment, studies, impact assessment, etc. I want to stress this point very much. And by the way, some of you will remember that back in December 2015, this delegation organized a public workshop on one of these consultations. It was the one on online platforms, one in Washington, and we did a kind of twin one in San Francisco. So we also reached out to the US physically to hear the views of stakeholders here. Those US stakeholders could, and in many cases have, replied to those consultations directly by submitting material to Brussels. I'm saying that because, especially after the latest package that we adopted as part of the DSM, which was a few days ago, the so-called e-commerce package, which we will briefly touch upon, I heard a few rather high-level individuals coming to me and telling me, well, everything you're doing is a solution in search of a problem. And I must say, we take issues with that, because we can disagree that the solutions that we are finding to the issues might not be the right one. We might have disagreements on that. At the end of the day, we come from different traditions, both legal and cultural and political, so we have to agree to disagree on certain issues. But suggesting that we have not done our homework and we have not run a very extensive consultation and assessment process, well, that, I'm sorry to say, is incorrect. As a matter of fact, a number of people and organizations, et cetera, even accuse us of putting out too many consultations. So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. That's the life of a civil servant, I guess. Now, this schema, this table, identifies the main packages that we are working on as part of the DSM. Again, I apologize to the people in the back. I'm not sure you can see this very well, but the slides will be distributed. And what I'm going to do is try to guide you through the main initiatives that we have launched so far, because again, I want, to the extent possible, I want people in the room and those who are listening via webcast to understand that even though we know perfectly well that here in the US there is a very strong attention to specific parts of the DSM strategy, in particular when it comes to online platforms and audiovisual media services, etc. But the DSM strategy is a very big piece with many different moving parts. And you cannot really assess what we're doing on one side if you do not at least have a passing knowledge of what we're doing on the other side as well. So the first initiative which I'm going to mention is the package we adopted in December the 9th, the proposals we adopted on December the 9th, 2015. They concern digital contract rules, a proposal for regulation on content portability, and our strategic outlook on our corporate modernization action plan. Very briefly on digital contract rules, the European Commission adopted two proposals for regulation. One is a proposal for a directive on certain aspects. I actually have the papers here, so I shouldn't be looking there. One is a proposal for a directive on certain aspects concerning contracts for the supply of digital content, and another directive for legal reasons they were split. I'm told there were very good legal reasons why we had to use two different legal instruments. The other is a proposal for a directive on contracts concerning online and distance sales of goods. And basically what these pieces of proposals, again, allow me to remind you, these are proposals from the European Commission. They are right now being negotiated between the European Parliament and the Council. So you can check when you will receive the slides, you will see that every slide has a link in the top bottom right corner where you can find all the papers, more papers than you ever wish for, believe me, and you can read all the details there. But it's important to keep in mind when it comes to legislative proposals, what you will have is the proposal from the European Commission. What will come out of the process, well, again, we will have to wait and see how the negotiation go. In any case, basically, both the two legislative proposals for the digital contract rules, they basically boil down to a few additional safeguards for consumers, which concern, one, the supplier's liability for defects. We are basically reversing the burden of proof. If I, as a consumer, claim that a good that was sold to me via distance means or a digital good is defective, it's the obligation of the supplier to prove that it was not defective, not my obligation as a consumer to prove that. We also harmonize and in many cases extended the duration of after-sale service and warranties. So if I understand correctly, it's now 2 years, our proposal is that it should get to 2 years all across after the sale, all across the EU. There are some other minor details, such as if the product has minor defects, then the seller is obliged to replace it with a functioning good. Now, all of this might seem very obvious, but we saw in our assessment for this particular package that there was quite a bit of fragmentation across the European Union. This inhibited the cross-border. The extent to which commercial transaction via commerce, yeah, sorry about that. It will reboot, I guess, and then we will continue. So if you don't mind, I will continue because I don't know how long Windows usually takes 15 minutes to reboot, so I'll go on. The other proposal, part of that package, concerned a proposal for regulation to ensure the portability, the cross-border portability of online content. Because we have situations, I know this is pretty crazy here in the US. It's difficult for me to explain to US friends, much like it's difficult to explain telephone roaming, mobile roaming charges in the US. It's difficult to explain this as well, but it does exist that if you buy digital content in one country and then you decide to go for 1 month to another country for whatever reason, in several cases you can't access that content anymore. Yes, go ahead. You cannot access that content anymore. If you need a keyboard, it's... Okay, you got it. So basically what we are proposing with this piece of legislation is that in those cases when there is a temporary movement of a person from the country, from the member state where that digital content was legally acquired to another member state, it's the obligation of the content provider to put in place the appropriate systems to make sure that that person can still access that content. Now, that can be subject to all kinds of verification mechanism because we also want to avoid, we also want to avoid the illegal bypassing of business models, but there has to be the possibility subject to the appropriate security measures for a consumer to do that. And last but not least, oh, thank you very much, Sergio. So, yeah, no, I'm going to use the keyboard. Thank you. Yeah. That was faster than I thought. And then the third part of that package, which again we adopted on the 9th of December 2015, is our action plan on corporate modernization. Now this is, I'm sure, it's a very hot topic here in the US as well. People say that copyright has not developed as fast as digital technologies or the new use cases or business models have done. So there is a reflection ongoing both in the US and the European Union how to do that. What we did back in December, I believe very transparently, we told the general public, these are the 4 main issues that we are reflecting upon. This is not a legislative proposal. What we did in December 2015 was not a legislative proposal all across the our copyright policy. It was simply telling people these are the 4 main areas in which we are going to continue consulting, and after the summer 2016, so it will be around September, October, we will come up with whatever legislative or non-legislative proposal we believe is necessary following the consultation in these fields. And these 4 main areas concern the widening access to content across the EU, which includes access, cross-border access to content, which is still in many cases, in several cases, difficult in the EU. It includes an harmonization and upgrading of the exceptions and limitation to copyright, which here in the US, the most similar thing to that you have here in the US is the fair use doctrine. We have, in most European countries, we have a different system, so we talk about exceptions and limitations. And there, for example, we are reflecting how can we make sure that they are harmonized, and the keyword harmonization for us is very important because there is no use in having 27 exceptions if they are completely different from one member state to the other. If that is the case, then people cannot, companies, researchers, people cannot scale, basically, because they have to deal with very different, at the end of the day, legal systems all across the board. One thing that we're thinking about in the field of exceptions and limitation to copyright, for example, concerns how can we make it easier to do text and data mining on copyrighted text? Because technically speaking, when you do text and data mining, you are copying content. And that in many member states, I'm not sure about the US copyright law, but in many member states does trigger the protections that are afforded to copyright. So the question is, should we make an exception limitation to that, and how can we make sure that it is harmonized so that our researchers and scientists and even businesses, if the case might be, can actually perform those sorts of actions. It's also about, by the way, it's also about supporting people with disabilities. It's very unclear at the moment across the European Union how can people with sight problems, for example, how can they use special devices which would technically copy the text? So again, it does trigger the copyright protection in order to turn them into speech, and then they can listen. All of this, for the moment, is pretty unclear. So there is a need to reflect on how we can, A, which kind of level of exception limitation we want, and B, how we can harmonize them at the EU level. We are also reflecting, I know this is a big deal here in the US, but very honestly, we're also reflecting, this is not about what some people have talked about, the link tax. It's not about taxing people or companies because they link to other content. That has never been on the table, honestly. It would be stupid, silly. I don't even know how we would enforce that. But there are situations, there are issues that have certainly been signaled to us in which companies out there, they use significant snippets of text from another source, and they use it for their own commercial advantage. Now, where do you draw the line? Because you might argue that this actually does help the original content producer. It gives it more visibility, fair enough. Some content producers say, well, we actually don't want that visibility. We want to control how our text is used. So again, there is a need for a reflection on that, which I think should be an objective reflection, avoiding name calling on one side or the other, which is never useful. And then we also have, as part of this reflection, we need to understand how we can fight copyright infringement more effectively, preserving the rights of all interested parties, but also recognizing that there are operations out there, there are commercial operations out there whose business model is massive, large-scale copyright infringement, and that is simply not acceptable to us. Now, this is about what we call the copyright 1. There is a copyright 2 as well, but we will not cover it today because it is yet to come. This is the copyright 1 package, which was adopted in December 2015. The next one, and I'm just going to touch this very briefly, is the proposal for the decision we call the 700 megahertz proposal. And that is, at the end of the day, I mean, if you really go down to the nuts and bolts, it's pretty simple as a concept. It will be a difficult discussion. It is a proposal by the European Commission for a decision with a capital D. It's just a particular kind of legal instrument that we use in the European Union to allocate the 700 megahertz electromagnetic spectrum band for mobile internet. That band is in the European Union is currently mostly used by television providers. And this proposal for the decision follows an intensive set of consultations with member states and discussions. And my sense, and I had to say I'm not an expert on these matters, but my sense is that there is a political consensus that the current situation is hardly sustainable because we need that spectrum to promote internet access. On the other hand, we also need to make sure that the transition for audiovisual broadcasters in the EU is done in a coordinated fashion, which is why our proposal is to basically, is for member states to take a clear obligation and put in place a clear action plan for that transition to the 700 megahertz band, the use of the 700 megahertz band for internet services to take place by 2020. That's the kind of time frame that we're thinking about. Now, one point that I want to touch upon, I don't want to spend too much time on this because it has been beaten to death here in the US and it would deserve a meeting, a workshop in and by itself. But I do want to mention it. If you remember, when I presented the general outline of the digital single market strategy, I did talk about trust and security. That for us is an absolute basis without which nothing of what we are doing will ever come to fruition. I should also point out that very recently the NTIA, part of the Department of Commerce here in the US, published a very interesting report, the result of a very extensive analysis that they did on US households, in which it appeared that almost half of US households are either not using the internet or have severely diminished the use of the internet out of fear for their privacy and security. That's half households in the analysis. This is a US NTIA analysis that are not using the internet or not using it as much as they could because of trust issues. So clearly this is a transatlantic issue. It's not just our problem. So as part of the trust issue, as many of you know, after 4 years of negotiations on the, I believe it was on the 14th of April, 2016, that's the official date, we finalized and adopted the General Data Protection Regulation, which is an update of our 1995 Data Protection Directive. And it does maintain the basic principles of the directive. Frankly, if you know how the Data Protection Directive, the EU 1995 Data Protection Directive works, you already have the basis on how the regulation is going to work. On the other hand, there are also certain changes in the regulation, certainly a stronger focus on the data subject, the individual rights. It's perhaps even a little bit stronger than the 1995 directive. And some of the, I'm sure nobody can actually read this. This is really for later distribution. But some of the new things in the GDPR, which are, I believe, of interest here, is, for example, the easier access to one's own data. There is a stronger right for the data subject to request the so-called data controller or data processor, mostly data controller, which is the organization which has the primary responsibility over the handling of my data. I have a stronger right with the GDPR to say, I want to know precisely how you're using my data. Where is it going? Who have you given it to? What are you actually doing with that? We have new rules in the GDPR about data breach notification. So in case there is a data breach, there has to be a quick notification at the very least to the competent authority in the member state. We have introduced the concepts which are actually obligation, what we call data protection by design and by default. And what that means, they're kind of buzzwords, but what it means in practice is that especially in fast-moving environments, and I've been in the IT sector for quite a bit of time, it happens very frequently that you design a product, you roll out a product, or actually you are on the point of rolling out the product, and then 1 week before the actual rollout, somebody in the company comes up and say, guys, I really don't think that we have considered the privacy implications of this very well. Now, at that point, it's pretty difficult to go back and redesign the whole product, and this creates all sorts of issues. Now, what we're saying in the GDPR is you have, as an organization, you have to demonstrate that either in your products or in your service offering, whether you're a public or private organization, you need to demonstrate that you have thought about these things. And data protection authorities can request an organization to provide proof, documentation that certain kind of questions have been asked, basically. That's what it amounts to. Now, let's jump onto the next package that we adopted in April. So this was 14th of April 2016. Again, let me remind you, copyright 1, December 2015, the 700 megahertz decision, proposal for decision, February 2014, adoption, 16, adoption of the GDPR, 14th of April 2016. And then on the 19th of April 2016, we adopted another package, which we call the Digitizing European Industry package. And what this package, I would say, I particularly like it. It's one of my preferred parts of the DSM. It's also pretty complex. But the basic idea behind this package, adopted on the 19th of April 2016, and this is, by the way, mostly a non-legislative package. This is mostly about helping coordination, funding through our research and innovation program, Horizon 2020, and so on and so forth. But the idea there is what I mentioned at the beginning. Sorry. I will manage to block this, I think. Sorry. The idea with this package is, as I said before, we have so many sectors of our traditional, quote-unquote, industries which are not digitizing fast enough. Some sectors are very much behind, SMEs are very much behind. This is about how you sell your products, how you commercialize your products, how you engage with your consumers, but it's also how you design your products. It's also how you build your products. And digital technologies can provide, in our view, can provide incredible added value, but they're simply not being used enough, at least in the European Union. And our member states actually recognize this because this map is a first look at all the different national initiatives on digitizing national industries. Now, you cannot read all of them, but believe me, there is a lot of them, really a lot. And the problem or the challenge with this initiative from our perspective is that they are mostly national. And being mostly national, they tend to be rather uncoordinated with the neighbor next door. They don't scale very well. On the other hand, we don't want to replace them. That's not our job as the Commission. So what we are actually doing is we want to help coordinate these national initiatives, also by putting in place money for the creation of what we call digital hubs. It's around €500 million for the next 2 or 3 years, if I remember correctly, 500 million euros. The idea is to create or to facilitate the creation of hubs where you will have companies, academia, research center, SMEs, and the hope is that it's not about, and I want to be very clear on this, it's not about recreating Silicon Valley in Europe. That's not the idea. But in some ways, you can think about Silicon Valley as one of the best digital hubs that you can think of. It's a combination of different players who have created this ecosystem, and this creation was due to many reasons, but there is this ecosystem in which different players, they interact with each other, and the end result, I would say, is pretty good, to be objective about it. So we want to support that without necessarily copying what is happening in other parts of the world, but using our own expertise and skills and entities that we already have on the ground. We will also present a EU skills agenda. That's the other big issue that we have. The problem is that we know that there will be a great offer for jobs or a demand for jobs by companies which require digital skills, whatever that might be, software development, design, knowing how to use a 3D printer. And sorry to say, but our schools and universities in Europe are not producing those skills nearly fast enough. That's an issue which we will, the crunch time will arrive in 5 or 6 or 7 years, and the European Union per se does not have primary responsibility on education system. Again, keep in mind the institutional system in which we work, so we cannot tell member states, the Commission cannot tell member states, this is how your academic curriculum should look like. But we do have the money and the funding, and in cooperation with member states, we can support a number of different initiatives, whether it's higher level education, vocational education, etc., to go in that direction. Let me accelerate a little bit, if you don't mind. So, as part of the Digitizing European Industry package, we also adopted what we call the European Cloud Initiative. Now, this is one of those things, together with the discussion online platforms, that since I arrived in the US, I know has my US friends constantly stressed. Every time they hear about the European Cloud Initiative, everybody starts jumping up and down. We want to build Fortress Europe, and we're going to do, it's none of the sort. I want people to really calm down on this. The idea of the European Cloud Initiative is to basically build we like to think a world-class data infrastructure, data processing and networking infrastructure, mostly for scientific purposes. We do believe, though, that if we build that kind of infrastructure, this will have very significant downstream effects on all kinds of businesses, because that's where scientists can do the kind of basic research with, if we have that infrastructure in place, with lower entry cost for your average university or researcher, and that research will also have downstream effects on businesses, whether large or small. And we actually believe quite a bit in that, to the extent that we are actually putting 2 billion euros out of Horizon 2020 funding our research and innovation program into building this kind of infrastructure. But again, I want to be very clear, this is not about excluding cloud providers. There's nothing in this initiative which says we are going to exclude the non-European cloud providers from the cloud market. The angle is really different here. I'm sure some people will believe me, some won't, but you're welcome to read the documents and check for yourself. I'm not going to go through this. This is kind of the timeline of how we foresee the European Cloud Initiative to roll out. You will receive the slides, so I will let you read the slides. Oh, sorry, I'm going back, which is not a good idea. Now, we're almost at the end. Bear with me, 5 more minutes, I hope. The latest package that we adopted as part of the DSM on the 25th of May, so just a few days ago, is the so-called content and e-commerce package. This package, which honestly, this is one of the most complex packages that we adopted in DSM. It's a lot of legislative proposals plus policy documents. I will confess, to be very honest with you, that I'm still reading all of the stuff. I'm still trying to understand everything, and actually your question will be helpful to me as well, because then I can tell Brussels the question doesn't come from me. A friend of mine has asked what this means, etc. But more seriously, the core of this e-commerce and content package is our review of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which is a rather oldish piece of legislation, which we already reviewed once, and it's the basic piece of EU legislation that covers broadcasters and video providers in Europe. Secondly, we made clear what our policy towards online platforms is. We put it on paper with a stamp of the European Commission, so there are no more discussions and doubts on what we actually think about online platforms. We put forward our legislative proposals on against geo-blocking, our legislative proposals on cross-border parcel delivery, and that is because, as bizarre as it might seem, one of the main obstacles to cross-border e-commerce in the European Union has nothing to do with technology or with digital technology. It has to do with the fact that delivering a parcel from point A to point B in the same member state can cost a lot less than point A to point C, which might be even closer, but if that second delivery crosses a national border, and there is absolutely no logic, at least to our view, there is no economic logic behind it. And then we also put forward a legislative proposal to strengthen the cooperation with, among our consumer protection agencies across the 28 member states and give them more powers in order to deal with specific issues that happen in the online environment. For example, the fact that you have all sorts of scams online which tend to be very quick. So you have something, a website which is scamming users with fake goods. It's up for 1 week, 2 weeks, and our current legislative processes are, our consumer protection agencies with the current legislative legal powers that they have, sometimes they don't literally have the time to go after these bad players. Now, very briefly, a couple of things I want to mention about this package. One is the review of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. What this review does is, A, it does introduce some slight further co-regulatory obligation for video sharing platforms, concerning in particular the protection of minors against what we call, certainly legal content, but also harmful content. For example, content glorifying violence or advertising of alcohol or tobacco, etc. Until now, there was no such obligation for video sharing platforms. This does not change the protection from liability that video sharing platforms have as intermediaries under our current legislation, but it does introduce a certain, they basically have to be a bit faster when they're notified that there are issues, and preferably they should put in place codes of conduct to deal more transparently and in a more structured way with this kind of issues. Secondly, we are strengthening the powers of our audiovisual media regulators. This, as you might know, and I don't really want to go into the discussion, but I think it's important to keep in mind that the strengthening of our audiovisual media services regulators, independent regulators, is also a reaction to a number of discussions that we had with a couple of our member states concerning the independence of their media regulators in the face of governmental pressure. I will not name names, and I don't want to discuss that, but bear in mind that we had those very practical issues in Europe with some media regulators being not independent, quite honestly, and basically allowing the national government to occupy the television spaces and not giving enough space to the opposition parties, and so on and so forth. Another point, and this is where I should wear my protective helmet, which I should have ordered from Amazon, is we are introducing an obligation for on-demand video providers to have at least 20% European movies in their catalog. I think there is one important thing to keep in mind here. First is that traditional broadcasters in Europe have an obligation to provide 50% of their content has to be European movies, all right? And until now, on-demand video providers have no obligation at all. Secondly, as a matter of fact, our assessment shows that the major on-demand video providers already provide that content. So in terms of the impact on their operation, this should make absolutely no difference, but it is a point of principle for us that if there is such an obligation for traditional broadcaster, there should be obligations also for audiovisual, for on-demand video providers. And last but not least, this obligation does not apply for very small video providers because we understand that SMEs or startups do not necessarily have the resources to cope with that. On online platforms, on online platforms, what we did is basically, as I said, put forward what our political vision, what our political position on online platform is. This has been a very, very, very extensive debate, leaks going around, and people calling me from California at 8 a.m. DC time, which was 5 a.m. California time, because they were very concerned about what was happening. Those people should really rest a bit more, honestly, and go to sleep at 5 a.m. Look, at the end of the day, after we made extensive consultation, two of which here in the US. We made an assessment. We conducted studies. Our conclusion is basically, we will not put forward horizontal regulations on online platforms. So we don't even know what that would mean in practice because we realize that online platforms are different, have different business models. They are anyway subject already to a certain extent to existing rules, for example, when it comes to antitrust or data protection and privacy. We do, however, believe that there are certain principles that have to be, that will guide our approach and should guide the national regulators' approach, because let's not forget, guys, that at the end of the day, the way the European Union system works is that for the largest part, enforcement is done at the national level. It's national regulators that actually, courts that actually have the first, at the first instance, they do whatever they decide to do with online platforms if they believe there is a problem. And there, our approach is basically, one, there is an issue of ensuring non-discrimination. And what this means is that if an online platform provides more or less the same service as a traditional provider, those two entities should be subject to similar rules. Now, what that means is that you can either impose further obligations, new obligations on online platforms, and admittedly, this is what we have done in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. People may agree or disagree, but that was the logic. There was an obligation for traditional broadcasters. We believe that there should be a similar adapted obligation for on-demand video providers. Or we can deregulate the traditional players. And to be completely clear, in the context of our targeted review, and this is the second part of our approach to online platforms, we are not going to have a horizontal regulation, but what we're going to do is, in the context of our continuous reviews of European legislation in different fields, whether it's in the telecommunication field or in other fields, we're going to assess whether there is a need to change those rules. And what might happen, I cannot commit at this stage because I cannot speak for the College of Commissioners. What might also happen is that in certain fields we might decide that there is a lot of competition in the quote-unquote traditional market, so we deregulate there. But by doing that, we make sure that there is actually, and I know that people here in this country hate the term, and I come to not like it very much myself, but we ensure a level playing field between these two different classes of entities. Now, we are also going to continue our reflection on what can platforms, importantly, the liability exemption regime, which comes from our Electronic Commerce Directive, does not change. On the other hand, we do believe that in certain specific fields, for certain specific purposes, there is value in having more targeted approaches, such as, for example, via codes of conduct. The Commission has just, I believe it was today or yesterday, has signed a major code of conduct with Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter, Google, and a few other large Californian companies. Well, sorry, Microsoft is up there, so West Coast companies, sorry to Microsoft if they're in the room, in order to fight, to counter more effectively hate speech online. That doesn't change their liability, but it does introduce an obligation, or those companies commit to making it faster and easier and to devote enough resources to actually follow up on notices that they might receive not only from the common citizens, but also from so-called trusted organizations. So if you have an association in a member state which has been monitoring hate speech for ages, and you receive a notice from that organization, you can probably trust that there is a real issue as opposed to receiving it from an anonymous John Doe somewhere that there is a problem. Last but not least, we are almost done, guys. I mean, this is just a presentation. I got colleagues who had to work on all this stuff. I just do the slides. Last point, which I think is important, is on geo-blocking. This is a legislative proposal for regulation that would basically, what we mean by geo-blocking is that we have proven cases. So this is not something we are coming up out of our dreams. We have made assessment, analysis, and we have proven a lot of proven cases in which consumers would try to access goods or services online in other member states. It would either be denied access to the website or they would be automatically rerouted to another website. You see, the example we always give, if I'm Italian, if I take my car and I go up to Austria, which is at the border, and I enter into a shop to buy a bagel or something, there is no way that the seller in Austria is going to ask me for my passport. And seeing that I'm Italian, not Austrian, is going to apply different price or is going to refuse to sell me that particular good. This is absolutely, if you think about it, this is completely crazy. It's something that really runs against the basic principles, which are, again, treaty principles of our internal market. So why would we allow the same kind of behavior online, except in specific cases, which you understand there can be very strong public interest legal obligation that exists in some member states, and we recognize that. But as a basic point of the geo-blocking regulation proposal is to limit as much as possible the possibility for companies, online providers, to discriminate on the basis of nationality within the European Union single market, on the basis of nationality, on the basis, for example, of the payment service used. So if you accept credit cards from MasterCard, you shouldn't be checking whether my MasterCard comes from an Italian bank or a Spanish bank or a French bank. It's a MasterCard. So you should just accept that kind of payment, which again is not what's happening in several cases. So this regulation basically proposes to get rid of that. Now, let me jump. I'm happy to cover this as well, but you will have the slides, and I think I've spoken enough. So we are going to work on cross-border parcel delivery. I said it. We are going to enforce. There is a legislative proposal to strengthen the activities of our consumer protection agencies. And with this, as of the 1st of June 2016, we are done. All right? But actually, not really, because allow me to repeat, and this is very important, everything that I have presented to you, it's either non-legislative in nature, so coordination, funding through our research and innovation programs, fine. And even there, the Parliament and the Council do have a say, because at the end of the day, the Parliament especially, but also the Council, they have the power of the purse. We propose the budget to the European Commission, but they have to approve that budget. But especially for legislative proposals, for legislative action, we made our proposal, and now it's up to the Council and the Parliament to negotiate those proposals. I would also point out that we basically discussed today the left part of this table. We still have, and this is what's upcoming in the next few months, the Copyright 2 package, which is going to be the follow-up to the Copyright Modernization Action Plan, and that's when we will make legislative proposals on all the issues that we have been assessing until now, around those 4 buckets which are in the previous slide. Is going to be the, sorry, again, I have it here, so I don't know why I'm looking there. Is going to be the launch of our cybersecurity contractual public-private partnership, which is going to be probably after the summer. That's the timeline that I'm told by Brussels. We're going to have a legislative initiative on the free flow of data within the European Union and not for what concerns personal data. What we are going to do and what we're assessing right now is how do we deal with all the enormous, huge amount of data that is generated by the Internet of Things and all the sensors that we have. Much of that is not personal in nature, and we need to make sure that that data can flow freely, certainly within the internal market, which we have for the moment anecdotal, and I believe more than anecdotal evidence that there are national obstacles to the free flow of that non-personal data within the European Union, and that we do not like, and we think is not conducive to the goals of the DSM and the goals of the internal market. And last but not least, we are going to publish the results of our telecommunication review, so an update of our telecommunication law. I believe it's going to be around September, October, and the result of our consultation on the Electronic Privacy Directive, which is a sectorial legislation on the application of privacy rules in the telecommunication sector, and that should arrive, I'm told, in December 2016. So as you see, by December 2016, our plan is to put on the table all the legislative and non-legislative proposals that we committed to in May 2015. With this, we're really over. You can find a lot of information at that website up there. Every single slide that you receive, or almost all of them, at the bottom right corner has a link which will point you to the press release, press package, frequently asked questions, and all the documents that you might possibly read. If you want to read all of that, I suggest that you take 2 weeks of vacation because it's going to be a very long read. And with this, I apologize, I went a little bit beyond what I had hoped, but I wanted to give you this overarching tour of where we're coming from, where we are, and where we are hopefully going to. And with this, I would like to open the floor to questions and answers. Please, we have microphones. State your name and your affiliation and ask your question. And by the way, as we give the microphone, please go ahead. Just one point. Keep in mind that the purpose of the conversation here is not so much for me to give you all possible details about these initiatives. I'm quite frankly not an expert in all of this, so I wouldn't be able to give you the answer. But what's really important for us as a delegation is to make sure we collect all the questions that exist in this room, online, and with stakeholders in the US, and we make sure that Brussels is very much aware of these questions. So please go ahead.
Thanks, Andrea. Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice. I had trouble sleeping last night, so I dove into the e-commerce package.
I'm sorry for you, but it's okay.
But I'm not sorry that I did, because I discovered some gems in there, a lesson learned from the European Union that is so remarkably relevant to this country and this town that it deserves more of a prominent placement in your package. And it has to do with how to tax cross-border sales. For you, the VAT. For us, it's the sales tax. And we've got 50 countries, twice as many as what you're dealing with. What your proposal includes is a remarkable reversal from a decade of forcing small businesses to file taxes and be audited by where the consumer lives. And you're switching that 180 degrees to let businesses file and be subject to audits in their home country, and then let the countries send the money to where the consumer lives. And the relevance of that to the US is that we've spent a decade struggling with how to tax cross-state online commerce. And this country's poised to go the way that you're leaving. This country's actually looking at 2 bills, the Marketplace Fairness Act, that would force us to adopt the exact system that you're running away from in Europe. So the relevance of that to the debate here in Washington is so high that I strongly encourage you to share the lessons learned that you have, because businesses faced a huge barrier collecting taxes and being subject to audits from the 26 EU member countries. And if you're turning away from that towards something like what Chairman Goodlatte's looking for, this is an opportunity for harmonization of approaches and to learn lessons from Europe. And I thank you for that.
Thank you, Steve. Just a quick reaction. I'm not an expert in taxation issues. Usually my eyes glaze over as soon as I get to that section, but I get your point, and I'm happy to hear that, so I will make sure our colleagues in Brussels are aware of that. Although for the record, because this is in record, I do need to point out that, of course, we do not get into the debate. The domestic debate here in the US, that's a decision for US people, but I think we can certainly, and I will tell colleagues in Brussels, there is at least some interest in showing what's the direction in which we're going in the European Union, and then we can have a discussion. Thank you for that, Steve. Any other questions, points, comments? Don't be shy, because we still have some time, and I'm not going to let you out before I get at least 5 or 6 questions. So one here and one there, and then I'd like also to check if we have any online questions via Twitter. Okay.
Hi,
Cal, yeah.
Andrea. First of all, thank you very much for this. This is really, really useful, so I really appreciate this briefing. So my name's Carl Schonender. I work for the Software and Information Industry Association. And I wanted to mention the Free Flow of Data initiative, which you, this has been true from the get-go, specifically said does not include personally identifiable information. Although, as many people have noted, including there have been some great studies by the Swedish Board of Trade, it's in practice very often quite difficult to distinguish personally identifiable information from non-personally identifiable information. So I guess my question is, if the free flow initiative goes forward, once the general data protection regulation enters into force, which is supposed to happen on May 25, 2018, will you, at least within the European Union, in effect have free flow for both forms of data? Because at least the reading I have is that you really have to have that in order to reap the benefits of this digital economy and, for example, go forward with Internet of Things, et cetera, et cetera. Thanks.
Thank you, Carl. Do you mind if I answer that and then I give you, because my short-term memory is getting very, very bad and then I will forget the question that was asked. A couple of things, a couple of reactions, and thanks for raising this, Carl. The first is that the Free Flow of Data initiative is, as I was informed by Brussels, is an initiative that is a legislative initiative that is supposed to come out at the end of 2016, which means that right now we're still in a process of gathering information, discussing internally, discussing with stakeholders. I'm saying that because there is not, frankly, there is not a lot of detail more than what I have shared with you that I can share at this moment. What I will say, though, is that when it comes to indeed, when it comes to personal data, frankly, already on the basis of the 1995 Directive on the Protection of Personal Data, we do have, as a point of principle, a free flow of personal data within member states. And to the extent that member states, legislation or regulation or administrative rules prohibit that for whatever reason, the onus is on the member state to show why they're doing it. Because the basic principle since 1995 is that personal data can freely flow within the European Union. The regulation, the GDPR, in our view, will make that even clearer, not the least because being a regulation, and without boring you with the technical legal details, but being a regulation is directly applicable all across the 28 member states, as opposed to the 1995 directive, which had to be transposed by each member state, and member states tended to transpose it in slightly different ways. I get your point that it can be sometimes difficult to distinguish between personal and personal data, and I think it is fair to say that in our legal system, and we make no apology for that, but in our legal system, the definition of personal data tends to be extensive, tends to cover a lot of data because it is sufficient to have even an indirect link with a natural person, with the data of a natural person to qualify as personal data. It is, though, a case-by-case assessment. We also believe, though, that there is a significant amount of data which is truly either anonymized or was never personal in the first place, and it would be very, very difficult, if not almost impossible, to reconduct the data to personal identifiable information. I'll give you an example, weather data. Okay, that's an incredible source, potential source of innovation. I challenge anybody to tell me, to show me that weather data is personal data under our framework. I don't believe it is. And what we are seeing is that there are instances of some member states applying very, I would say, with all due respect, some rather bizarre interpretation of their own administrative rules or even European administrative rules to make it more difficult to transfer or to ensure that that kind of non-personal data flows from one member state to the other. I think we agree, actually we fully agree on the rationale and the objective, which we want the data to flow around. At this stage, we are still assessing what that would entail in practical terms. To be fully clear, though, and to I hope I answer your point, your question, or react correctly to your points. To be clear, the free flow of data will not impact the General Data Protection Regulation because the scope is, from our perspective, different. And when it comes to personal data, we have rules in place which will become enforceable, as you say, in 2018, which costed us 4 years of negotiations, plus 2 years of preparation. So we're not going to simply redo those kind of rules very easily. And I hope I correctly reacted to your point, Carl. Yes.
Rick Lane with 21st Century Fox. First of all, what a great presentation. I mean, this is the most clear presentation I've heard in explaining the digital single market, so thank you very much. I had a question, though. You mentioned on the issue of audiovisual content and that here in the U.S. we wouldn't understand how you can't gain access to your content as you go around the country, which is interesting because all of our content is actually territorial here in the U.S., our broadcast stations. In fact, we're having a huge fight at the FCC on this idea of an open set-top box, which allow our content and all of our licensing agreements through individual MVPDs that are all specific to that specific MVPD to be opened up.
What's an NFPD?
Oh, I'm sorry, multi-visual, it's a MVPD, multi-visual cable company satellite distribution entity. And so the problem for us is, as you're looking at this border, we already have, you keep pointing to the US that we wouldn't understand, but we do that today. We do have territoriality, we do have specific contracts within a jurisdiction. A local television station, for example, is only allowed to show its shows within a specific area, like Baltimore or Washington, D.C., and they can't cross over. So I'm just curious, and when you're trying to explain that to folks in the U.S., and you say, we don't understand this issue, what do you mean by that?
So first of all, I was not implying that you have generally difficulty in understanding. That's just that sometimes the communication can be, we make assumptions on each other's, apparently, we really do make assumptions on each other policy environment, which might be incorrect on both sides. What I meant by that is that what we have been told in the run-up to the e-commerce package, as 25 different leak versions started to go around, at a certain point I didn't even know what we were actually doing because there were so many leaks and I cannot comment on leaks. Anyway, we had plenty of conversation with different stakeholders, both in government and the private sector. My understanding is that the one thing that they were really, I think I can diplomatically say they were very upset about, was the 20% rule. So the obligation for on-demand video providers to have 20% of European works in their catalog. I don't want, I'm not going to go back to the slide. We have been told that that kind of obligation does not exist in the US, nowhere in the US, which we are very happy to believe. On the other hand, on that I have to say, look, our treaties are very clear. We have an obligation to protect the cultural diversity of Europe. It's a value issue for us, so we are not going to apologize for that. On your point, on the, I'm not aware that actually in the context of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, issues have been raised, at least not to us here at the delegation, concerning the kind of territoriality issue, mostly because the Audiovisual Media Services Directive already had and still has the so-called country of origin principle. It's a basic principle of that directive which remains in this review, which basically means that if you're established in a member state of the European Union, you can broadcast or transmit or send internet packets to any other member state of the European Union. You're subject to the laws of the member state of origin, which also from our perspective will help. There will be member states which will try to apply all kinds of let's say, problematic additional obligations on demand and traditional broadcasters. We believe that this country of origin principle that we have will actually balance that issue, because a broadcaster who doesn't like how a particular member state is applying the rules of the directive will move to another member state, and it still has the right to broadcast and transmit to all the other member states. What you're referring to, I think it concerns more an issue of licensing, of territorial licensing, which we are not, for the time being, we are not yet really addressing. We do have the content portability proposal from December. That's for temporary movement of a person to another country. It's one of the things we are assessing in the context of the copyright modernization of copyright action plan. And it does, I mean, people say that it relates to geo-blocking. We think that the geo-blocking issue is not an issue of licensing, quite frankly. And in fact, I could not go into the details, but the geo-blocking regulation specifically carves out certain sectors, including the audiovisual sector, because that is covered by the directive. Sorry for the long answer. My short answer is it's always interesting to me to hear, very often when we talk to business representatives here in the US or even the US government, we are told that things in the US work, allow me to be a bit flippant, if I may, work perfectly, and we should actually, and why we're coming up with these silly ideas in Europe. And sometimes when you go and kind of scratch under the surface, yes, you do discover that in the US, in different fields, you also have segmentation, you also have fragmentation, as it's normal in any big market, which has developed through the years. I hope
Thank
that's...
you. No, that's
yeah.
very good. And on the portability, we are looking forward to working with the EU and how to figure that out in a good way.
Excellent.
Andrea, we have a question from Mary Hanley on Twitter asking what research has established that increasing consumer trust online will boost e-commerce.
Sorry, can you repeat the question, Martin? I didn't...
So Mary's asking what research has established that increasing consumer trust online will boost e-commerce.
All right. So I understand is why do we assume there is a causal link
Exactly.
between trust and boost of e-commerce. Okay, we do have research. What I can do, if that's okay for the, sorry, I forgot the name. I didn't get the name for
Mary.
For Mary. If she's okay with that, I will collect the studies that we have conducted as part of the impact assessment to the e-commerce package, and I will share them. We will share them with her. We do have, we are pretty convinced. We do have pretty convincing data from our Eurobarometer surveys, which are the scientific surveys we run on many different fields, on very large segments of the European population. They are scientifically sound and statistically representative. People tell us that they have not bought stuff online, or they have not acquired services online because, among different reasons, but one of the significant reasons was that they were afraid that their private data would be misused, that their credit card would be stolen, by their credit card numbers or data would be stolen. In short, that they did not trust the infrastructure and the system enough. And again, allow me to repeat that this is not a European conclusion. At the very least, it's a transatlantic conclusion because, as I said, the NTIA, part of the Department of Commerce, reached exactly the same conclusion with a scientific survey just a few weeks ago. Half of US households are not using the internet because they're not using it as much as they would like to use it because they have an issue of trust on their privacy, on their security. But we will share with Mary the details of our assessment. There is a question back there, I think, and one there. So if we can go first there, and one there, sorry about that. So first there, and then back there.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Lori Schulman. I'm with the International Trademark Association. Thank you for, again, I agree with Rick. This was extremely clear because sometimes I find the EU system a little confusing, and this was really
I'm shocked
clarifying.
to hear
I know.
that. So that's
It's great. So my question is this, and there may be no connection, but as I'm sitting here listening to your presentation, and I've also heard you speak in other fora about the Privacy Shield negotiations, and I'm wondering what connections, if any, are there between what's going on in the digital signal market and what's going on with the Privacy Shield negotiations and the agreement?
So I'll give you a perhaps unsatisfactory but broad and I believe fundamentally correct answer, and then I will try to briefly touch upon the specifics. I would not like to discuss too much about the Privacy Shield because it's not the topic of conversation today, and also because, as some of you might be aware, things are moving pretty fast, both in Europe and the US, so whatever I say now might be stale in literally 15 minutes. Having said that, if you go back with your mind to one of the first slides, the political guidelines of President Juncker, the President of the European Commission, the political commitment there was, and I believe the reality is that any digital regulation policy approach we have has to be horizontal. And that's not because we at the Commission think it should be horizontal, but because digital technologies have become widespread and pervasive. And I know, working here at the delegation, that I find myself working, surprisingly enough, privacy is not even formally part of my portfolio here in the delegation. And yet I find myself discussing those issues continuously because I deal with the tech sector and the digital technologies. And of course, there is that very strong connection. And I could say similar things for counterterrorism and cybercrime. None of that is part of my portfolio, but I have, with many colleagues who are responsible for those policy areas, I have to work on that. So that's a convoluted way to answer you. You can basically find connections between the digital single market strategy and almost everything that we're doing, even agricultural policy. Agri-tech is apparently a big thing in the next 5 to 10 years. More, technically to the point, though, the Privacy Shield discussions follow are based on a certain legal framework that is the 1995 directive, and when it will become enforceable, the 2016 General Data Protection Regulation, which do indeed prescribe, that's our system, that personal data has to flow freely within the European Union, but by default cannot go out of the European Union to any third country, whether that's the US or any other, unless certain conditions are met. As you all know, there was an issue. Our Court of Justice, our European Court of Justice, found that the previous system, one of the previous systems that we were using, the Safe Harbor framework, was not legal, basically. And so we have been accelerating discussion that had already been ongoing with the US on finding or strengthening the Safe Harbor, which resulted in the Privacy Shield, which is still a draft. So those discussions are ongoing. They are very important for our DSM strategy. So believe me, those of us who work on the DSM follow very closely what's happening in the Privacy Shield negotiations. But the team that works on one is not the same team that works on the other, because at the end of the day, these are two slightly, I would say they are very related, but slightly different issues. And the DSM, at the end of the day, is really about the internal markets. It's really about how the internal market works in the European Union. Now we're in a globalized world, and we realize that we cannot simply, if we thought that it's all about the internal market and to hell with anybody else, that would be Fortress Europe. And we are not about Fortress Europe, so we need to take into account also the international dimension of what we're doing, including the Privacy Shield. I don't know if that answered your question. I feel like this was a very long-winded and diplomatic non-answer to your question, but I hope it kind of gave the approach that we're following on this matter. I think there was another question there. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. Robert Grant with Mitsubishi Corporation here in Washington. I saw in the front page of yesterday's Financial Times that there was a suggestion, as I think you've echoed this morning, that there will be no sort of horizontal regulation of platforms. But the fact that you're not saying that there could easily be plenty of vertical regulation of sort of sectoral specific platforms, should we then presume that will come, and that what sort of timeline might we expect for that? I mean, in my personal view, certainly not the view of Mitsubishi Corporation, there are certainly some e-commerce providers that seem to be doing terribly well, in part because they've been able to be brought into the market extremely quickly and thereby avoided a lot of the regulations that sort of bricks and mortar and inverted commas businesses have not been able to avoid. And I think in many markets we actually need government to sort of hurry up and realize this, because oftentimes inferior quality providers are actually doing rather better, and it seems pretty unfair. So your view, thank you.
Thank you for the question. As I think I mentioned before, I've been almost 10 years at the Commission, and I learned not to presume anything ever about what the Commission will or will not do. But having said that, if you actually, I am not aware of upcoming vertical proposals related to platforms, although, and we have been very clear, this is in the communication and the policy statement on online platforms that was adopted as part on the 25th of May. We do say that as part of the review of our existing legislation, we will consider whether changes to those legislation, whether in the telecommunication field, in the online privacy, e-privacy field, are warranted in order to make sure there is no discriminatory treatment between new online platforms and existing players which de facto provide very similar services, but they just did not until now do it prevalently on the internet. So that's one thing. The second thing, let's keep in mind that actually the European Commission, and I know this is part of the complexity of the EU system, I find the US system pretty complex as well, if I may say so. But anyway, we are mature democracies with a lot of people, a lot of citizens, so we are complex, generally speaking. But having said that, the European Commission has to publish every year a so-called Commission work program in which we actually have an obligation to put forward which initiatives we are planning to adopt in the upcoming year. So it's not like even if we had the manpower to basically write a proposal in 1 week and then push it out, we cannot do it. There are clear interinstitutional agreements between the different institutions exactly to avoid those sort of surprises. The last time I checked the Commission work program, I didn't see vertical legislative initiatives. Having said that, and I think the third leg, not pillar, but the third leg to my answer, is to my reaction. We do say in the communication on online platforms, this policy position we took on the 25th of May, that the fact that we believe that there is no need for a horizontal regulatory approach to platform, it doesn't mean that everything is perfect under the sun. We do realize, we have seen, we have data, I wouldn't say we have proof, but we have data that suggests that at least some online platforms, thanks to their position between two markets, to their kind of gatekeeping position between two or more markets, some of those platforms that are accumulating a lot of data, it's not clear at all whether they are internally firewalling the data enough, and that is might be a particular concern if those same platforms if those platforms are selling the same products or services that other people are using that platform to sell. That creates an unfair competition advantage for online platforms. What the Commission will do, we will assess this and other issues, which might, and underline might, raise competition/antitrust concerns. And I believe that what we committed to in this policy proposal is that by the end of 2016, we will publicly say whether we believe that further action, whether of regulatory or non-regulatory nature, is warranted. But at the moment, we simply, I think that we should not punish to the extent that we have successful players. It doesn't matter whether European or Americans. Let's not forget that U.S. companies which are originally in the U.S., when they operate in Europe, they also generate wealth and jobs and growth in Europe. Anyway, we are one of the most open, if not the most open market in the world, and it's never been our habit to push out companies as long as they operate according to our rules, which we believe are non-discriminatory. So we don't think that we should punish companies because they're successful. We should punish companies if they are operating not according to the rules, and we should assess whether the rules still make sense, they still defend the principles of non-discrimination in the new technological environment. I see you have it coming back, if that's quick, because then I also wanted to pass. Please, go ahead if that's, but I would like you to have the microphone because otherwise people online cannot hear us.
So does that mean that we should look to DG Comp as for the sort of first initial signs that then might or might not lead to regulation? Or we'll just have to sort of read the tea leaves?
There is no such thing, and I don't mean to be flippant, I get your question, but there is no such thing as a DG when it comes to Commission initiative. The European Commission takes an initiative on the basis of input coming from different Directorate General of the European Commission, including DG Comp, but nothing happens until the College of Commissioners puts their signature. So yes, if you know people in DG Comp and you want to chat with them, good luck with that, because they tend to be very, very secretive about whatever they do for very understandable and good reasons. But the kind of assessment we're doing, as I said, might have antitrust competitive angle. It might not have it because when it comes, for example, to unfair competition, that's not something that necessarily involves antitrust issues. It does involve other parts of our legislative framework, which are handled by other parts of the European Commission. So it's always more complicated than it looks. I'm sorry about that, but yes, please.
I'm Roger Cochetti. I work with private equity and entrepreneurs in the technology sector, and have had the pleasure of working with you and your colleagues in the Commission on the digital single market for I guess about 20 years now for ComSat, IBM, VeriSign, Network Solutions, CompTIA, and others. And first, I think congratulations for what you have accomplished creating a digital single market of 450 million consumers out of 20 or 30 separate markets is an enormous contribution both for Europeans and I think for everybody doing work on the internet. But it does come with an important risk that I think it would be useful for you to address, and that is as you move from a regulatory environment of individual states to a regulatory environment of the European Union, inevitably, and for very good reasons, you reflect the values, legal systems, and history of the 450 million people who make up the European Union. The issue that it raises is whether the Union would encourage other segments of the global internet population to do much the same thing. In other words, obviously what the Union has done is parallel what has happened in the United States because we are a single nation, but would or does the European Union encourage the same development of a comprehensive digital single market for China, for India, for Brazil, for South America, for Arab nations? In other words, the limitation of this approach that we simply need to recognize is that it moves us a step towards regional internets and a step away from global internets, and that's for lots of good reasons, and for Europeans lots of good reasons, and for global players, you certainly would rather have one market with one set of rules as opposed to 30 markets with a third set of rules. But that's not the same thing as a global approach. And I would say this is probably no more important than it is in the area of content, where, with all due respect, the difference between a government-approved code of conduct and a government regulation is very important, but can easily be lost on the people who are affected by it, because if the government changes, the code of conduct that they like is likely to change. So
All right.
Barack Obama's code of conduct would probably not be Donald Trump's code of conduct.
I will not
and we
comment
have
on
to
that.
accept that.
Thank you. You put a lot in this point, which I think is an important point. So let me try, to the best of my abilities, to unpack it a little bit. First of all, I very gladly take your congratulations for building the digital single market, but to be completely fair, we are building it. We don't have it yet. So I'm afraid the congratulations are a bit premature. We hope we will get there, but we are not there yet. And it's important for us to recognize it, that it's always going to be a work in progress. Even the traditional single market that we started working on in the late 80s still has some problem here and there, which is why we like to think that's one of the reasons for our existence at the European Commission, to make sure that that internal market still persists. Now, if I understand correctly your point, I think there are two angles to your point of an increasing move towards regionalization of, let's call it quote-unquote, digital regulatory or semi-regulatory approaches to the internet, and which kind of consequence that has. What I would say to that is, first of all, of course, we should be aware, and that is true for the US, for Europe, we should be aware that what we do has implications globally, that people look at us, not only because they take us as a model, but also because we have trade relations with many parts of the world, so the kind of things we do does have an impact there. So we should cognizant of that. With all possible and due respect, I do sometimes have the impression that in the US political debate, that is not exactly the top of the priorities. The kind of effects that decisions taken here in the US will have in the rest of the world is not necessarily at the top of the list. Sometimes it happens in Europe as well. But at the end of the day, though, as much as we have to take that into account, because we are democracies, and our democratic legitimacy comes from our citizens, from our voters. So as much as I think it's beneficial to European citizens that there exists a good transatlantic digital market and link, and also the European Union has good relationship with our trading partners, including the digital sector, if faced with the choice of should I make the interests of European citizens or non-European citizens, my answer is clear. I am a Commission official. My priority is European citizens. That's what that's what I work for. The other point that you did raise, which is the kind of regulatory fragmentation, I think that's the kind of angle. I have a very different take on that, because I think that what is actually happening, I think that for a long time, and this is the kind, with all respect, the cyber libertarian approach that was very present on the west coast of this country for a long time. I think it's still there, but it's kind of under, it's an undercurrent, but it still informs a lot of the discussion there. The idea was that we would have a global regulatory environment which would happen to be exactly the same as California law. Now, that is kind of difficult. I'm exaggerating, but if you talk, as you probably did, with some of the early entrepreneurs from that part of the US, which are great entrepreneurs and their innovations are great, don't get me wrong, but when it comes to laws and policy, they would tell you, why would we apply anything different than the California or US federal law? It's the best possible law in the world, which I'm not questioning it is, but I am saying that for the rest of the world, that's a difficult conversation to have. Now, if you accept that that was actually not the reality in which we were moving, it was the pipe dream of some very rich people, very successful and very rich people. And actually the reality was that we had a huge amount of regulatory fragmentation up until not long ago. And what we're doing now is actually, from my perspective, is moving towards more, I wouldn't say harmonization. I don't think we will ever have global harmonization, nor do I think it's a desirable end state, but we're moving towards more interoperability between different regulatory systems in the only way that is reasonable and possible, according to me, which is step by step, which is first you try to make the systems in a region, in a more cohesive region, more interoperable and more common. And then you can actually go and talk to your neighbors and say, okay, this is how we as a bloc think the internet should be regulated, quote unquote, or certain behavior on the internet should be regulated. Let's have a discussion. You can't have that if, and quite frankly, in the US, I'm perhaps going a little bit beyond my diplomatic role, but allow me to say that in the US, I believe that if you ask people in California, or if you ask people in Nevada, or if you ask people in Massachusetts about which kind of online behavior is acceptable and what are the responsibilities of internet intermediaries, you will get very, very different answers. So even in the US, there is a lot of, I wouldn't call it fragmentation, but there is a lot of difference. Having said that, the job of the federal government and of stakeholders is to try to find a common denominator among these different positions and engage with the rest of the world. So as I said, I don't think that's a risk. I actually think it's is the way it should be. Or I don't think we have, as a species, I don't think we have come up with a much better system to try to find interoperability between our systems. Yes, please.
Here, Axel Spies, Morgan Lewis. June
you're there, sorry.
23rd is not far away, better get up here, which means the vote in the UK on the Brexit. I wonder what effect that will have if the UK will vote in favor of the Brexit. On the digital market review, does it mean that things become much more difficult? Do we have to expect delays, or does it actually make things a little bit easier for you because you have certain aspects where you face opposition from the UK that you can perhaps put to rest, or will it be that it's the same? I mean, you don't care that much and you will just move on. So I'm wondering what your scenarios are.
I will not comment on the Brexit referendum. That's a matter for British people to decide. The only thing I would say is that we would prefer to have an internal market of 28 member states, but we can have an internal market of 27 member states. If that's the result, that's what we will do. It's not my opinion. I would like simply to point out that other stakeholders in the UK, including all the major tech business associations, have expressed a position on that matter, on the matter of Brexit, and I would refer you to those associations for what their position is. And that's all I would like to say on this particular matter. Thank you.
Kara Sutton, Transatlantic Business Council. Can you touch a little bit on ICT standardization and what's happening in DSM and also what's happening outside of the digital single market? Thanks.
Thank you, Carol. And I know I think I owe you a couple of emails since a long time. Sorry about that. So indeed, and that's something I had to skip because I was getting too late with my presentation, but as part of the April 19th package, so the Digitizing European Industry package, we also adopted a non-legislative communication, a policy statement on ICT standardization. And what we said that as the European Commission is, well, quite obviously, standardization is very important, both at the European level and in the global world. ICT standardization is even more important because of the cross-border international nature of the technologies that we are dealing with. And possibly there are ways in which the standardization processes in that particular sector, which is very fast-moving, might follow slightly different rules than the standardization processes in other sectors where safety issues, for example, are much more important and prevalent. That doesn't mean that we are going to change necessarily, we are going to massively change our standardization approach. As you might be aware, I believe it's news of today that the Commission has adopted the broader standardization, our approach to standardization more broadly, so even beyond the ICT standards, in which we did recognize that our European standardization system does need sometimes, if I can paraphrase what my colleagues have written, that our European standardization system does need sometimes to be a little bit more snappy. And but on the other hand, it also, we don't necessarily agree that every standardization process has to be, or let me rephrase, there are public policy concerns in standardization, which means that the government, in several cases, governments or the public sector cannot simply step back from a standardization process and let industry decide purely by itself what the standard should look like. On the ICT standardization, what we specifically said was that we would support through our funding in particular early testing, which is very important in standardization, because when you do standardization, if you've ever done that, it's, with all possible respect to my colleagues, one of the most boring things you can ever do, sitting at a standardization body. It's very important work, but it takes time and discussion, and it's very important that you experiment as soon as possible with whatever standard you are trying to implement, because otherwise it's all theoretical, especially in the ICT sector, it's all theoretical talk. So what we're going to do, we're going to support our lab centers, our research center, also the industry. We are co-funding on standardization, on experimentation, early experimentation and validation. In particular, we have identified 5 key areas in ICT standardization where we believe we should focus on, and they are 5G, telecommunication, mobile technologies, cybersecurity, data. Thank you. And there is a 5th one, which I can't remember, but it is in the slides. And so now I have to go back and check. Yeah. So it's 5G. 5G, cloud computing, Internet of Things, data, and cybersecurity. These are the 5 priority areas for ICT standardization which we're going to focus on in the manner that I described. It's very important for us to understand that we cannot legally, and we're not going to mandate standards in this area. That's not the way that the European standardization system works. We can request European standardization organization like ETSI, for example, to work in a particular field, but at the end of the day, we cannot tell ETSI, well, this is the standard that you have to come up with. That's not the way that the European standardization system, both in the ICT and in other fields, works. I'll get to you, Steve, in a moment, but I think there was a person waiting back there, please.
Thank you, Andrea. Mark Bohannon with Red Hat. Thank you very much for this presentation. Just a quick point of order. Is it possible for you to make these slides available to the...
They will be distributed to all the participants afterwards.
The second question goes to the public-private partnership for network and solutions and products that you mentioned during the discussion. And I recognize this may be a question you need to get back to your colleagues on. I think one of the, as the NIS directive was unfolding, I think a number of us were fairly pleased about how similar the US cyber framework was with the NIS. Obviously, we wait to see where the member states go on implementation, but at this point, relatively harmonious. I think there's a concern, because the partnership, as we understand it, will be organized as a not-for-profit organization under Belgian law. The draft that we've seen of the bylaws allows only European headquartered companies to be part of the governing board. I think this raises a number of questions. As I think we've learned from cyber issues, this is not an issue that is demarcated by political boundaries. I think we've learned both on the threat side and on the solution side that solutions and ways of addressing the threats can come from anywhere. It also stands in contrast to other similar partnerships that the Commission has encouraged, like data, the big data one that was established in recent years, where there was not that kind of specific exclusion of non-EU companies. So I think, as you're getting back to colleagues, I think worth noting that this is getting some notice, and I think it's something that is not, shall we say, a fruitful way to proceed if we're going to have an international approach to dealing with cybersecurity.
Thank you. I have not seen those draft bylaws, which means that either you have better access to Commission documents than I have, or I need to have a word with my colleagues in Brussels. So it could be either of the two. Sometimes my colleagues in Brussels, they forget to send me a rather important stuff. But so I cannot answer you on the specifics of the case, and we are aware it is a point of discussion. This I can say that we have been discussing extensively, and I understand that we're still discussing. We have, as you know, we have run a public consultation in recent weeks on this contractual public-private partnership for cybersecurity. So the point is taken. I will certainly relate it to Brussels. Let me point out, though, that I think we have to be a bit careful to compare PPPs, public-private partnerships, in different fields when it comes to cybersecurity and or security more general, because by definition, when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're also talking about very key core strategic interest of our countries. And I need to wonder, I don't know, honestly, it's a honest question, I don't know the answer, if there is anything similar to the public-private partnership on cybersecurity here in the US, whether EU headquartered companies could actually sit on the governing board of such a PPP. I don't have an answer to that question. Personally speaking, if that were not to be the case, I would not be particularly surprised, because we are talking about strategic interests. But please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we have a position on that, because I don't know, quite honestly. So I will relate back your question. I will certainly point out, my colleagues are aware that anyway, there is a concern here in the US that this, if I understand your point correctly, this might not be beneficial to stronger international cooperation on a common concern, if I get your point correctly. All right.
Andrea, and there is a question from Daphne from Stanford Center for Internet and Society.
Hi, Daphne.
She's wondering if the Commission's proposal on audiovisual media services or the Code of Conduct obliged platforms to use terms of service to remove otherwise legal content. Quite specific. But.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that Daphne would ask such a question. Daphne Keller is a friend and the director of intermediary liability at Stanford Center for Internet Society, so she's obviously very interested in this. So the question is whether the proposal for the Audiovisual Media Services Directive and or the Codes of Conduct would oblige companies to take down content that is per se legal. Is that the question?
Through terms of service.
Well, terms of service are a matter of contractual freedom between companies and their consumers. So a company can put in their terms of service, and we see that all the time, companies put in their contracts, we will not allow, whether these US companies or European companies, we will not allow consumers to post pictures of white kittens. That's a term of service, and that stands within the contractual freedom of companies. Now, I think it would be silly. Most people would not use that particular platform because we all love white kittens. But more seriously, I do not believe, but if I may, and if that's fine with Daphne, I reserve the right to double check, also with Brussels, but I do not believe that we are imposing an obligation on audiovisual on-demand services or on social video platforms to remove content which is per se legal. What we are saying is that there is a need to have core regulatory codes of conduct through which you can better check that children, for example, do not have access, or there is some kind of control over the kind of access the children have on material that from our perspective is provably going to be damaging to their mental and physical development, including advertising of alcohol or tobacco or other kinds of activities. That is my understanding of the state of play of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, but I will double check the specific question with the colleagues in Brussels, because let's be frank, it is a complex piece of legislation and I do not have all the answers off the top of my head, so I will ask Brussels, if that's okay with Daphne.
So it's a final run-up of the briefing. So maybe we may want to take several questions at a time.
Sure. So let me check, because there are two persons who already asked questions. I wanted to have one question from a person who didn't. And can I see a show of hand who wants to ask questions before the end? One, and there was Steve. So Steve first, he was in line, and then you. But first, please, Linda.
Yeah. I'm Linda Moore with Congressional Research Service. My question is, where did you put smart cities? I assume you stuck it in the Internet of Things, and if so, why did you do it that way, and why aren't you giving smart cities more of a research profile, because they have potentially a very important impact. Okay?
Yeah. Look, the quick answer to that is that I've been asking Brussels, where the hell do we put smart cities for 2 years, and I haven't received an answer, so I don't have an immediate answer to your question. I think at a certain point, you know, as in any strategy, choices are made to focus on what we believe are the underlying drivers of development that we need to focus on. That doesn't mean that what does not get specifically mentioned into any strategy or any piece of paper is not important. It does mean, though, that if you actually have a look at the documents, as I'm sure you have done, you will do, a lot of what we seem to agree about in the US and in Europe makes smart city, or will make smart cities tick. The Internet of Things, smart mobility, smart energy. These are all things that we are working on one way or the other. Within the DSM strategy, we have been working on within our research program for a very long time. as I'm sure you're aware, we do have a very long-standing program in the EU, which the Smart Cities, where this is one of those names that my colleagues come out with that I can never remember, is the SCCIP, the Smart Cities and Communities European Innovation Partnership, which not only has the longest title of any initiative in the world, but it is also actually a quite interesting and very, I think, very well designed way of federating different smart cities initiatives at the local and the national level, because our job there as the European Commission is not to tell cities what they should be doing. They know best what their local needs are. We do think there is a value in sharing information so that you can scale technology. Cities do not need to reinvent the wheel each and every time. So I would say it's there. I cannot tell you why it's not specifically in the map of the DSM. As we say in Brussels, those decisions are taken above my pay grade, so I just registered them. Steve.
Thank you, Andrea. Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice. On the slide for audiovisual services, we all stopped reading after it said a mandate for 20% content. The next sentence raises a question for you and for Brussels. The next sentence said that these new on-demand platforms would have to pay to send their content to European citizens. Sender pays. That comes as a surprise to many. And would that be applied in a non-discriminatory way, whether it was a European content or American content? And is there an exception in that notion for small businesses? This was on your audiovisual services summary slide. And it would be on the second bullet. The compensation, contribute financially to Europe.
Okay.
Yes.
So I try to be very fast, but your eyes are just too good, Steve. So it's more seriously, no, it's not a sender pays, at least not in the sense that you will use the term in the telecommunication environment. What that means is that bear in mind that our audiovisual rules we don't have a clean slate to start from. Okay, we do have existing rules in different member states, and we had an extensive negotiation. This is a review of an existing directive. What I'm trying to get at here is that this was probably a slight departure from our overarching principle of the country of origin principle, which I described before. What this means is that member states have the freedom. They don't have an obligation, but they have the freedom to ask on-demand video services which transmit content into their jurisdiction to ask it to the extent that they accrue revenue in the target jurisdiction to contribute to the development of local content, which is an obligation that already exists for the record for broadcasting, for broadcasters. I understand my colleagues told me that there was a certain point, there was a problem of forum shopping, that many companies were basically bypassing the national obligation that exists in most of the member states to contribute a minor part, I think it's around 1% or even less than that, of your revenues to the production of local content. But this is what this is about. Again, it's a freedom for member states to apply that, not an obligation. I would tend to think, I don't want to prejudge the negotiation, that certainly will be very vibrant on this as on other points. I would tend to think that if a member state comes up and says, well, you know what, we want to apply 30% levy on any content, the citizens of that member state will not see that content at all, and they will protest quite vigorously with their government. So I'm not, to be frank, I understand the principle, that the principle is of concern to some here in the US. As I said before, we believe that is functional to our treaty obligations to preserve cultural and linguistic diversity in the European Union, which is a primary obligation for us. We can disagree whether that's the right way to achieve that goal, but we cannot disagree, right? It's not a matter of discussion that it is a goal for us. And that is the way we chose to do that. I think it's the last, if you allow me, if there is anybody else who has not spoken yet, has not asked questions, no, then please go ahead.
Rick Lane again with 21st Century Fox. One point is I saw on one of your slides about figuring out the ownership of the data. And as you know, in the United States, you can't own data as long as it's facts. So that's going to be an issue that under the Feist decision, Supreme Court decision under Feist, it's something that's going to be a problem between the U.S. and the EU and how we work that out. So maybe we want to get ahead of that discussion early on. And the second thing, back in '99, I sat on the Federal Trade Commission's Advisory Committee for Online Access and Security, where we looked at the issue of ease of access for consumers to gain access to their data and the security of the data. As you're looking at security and privacy by design and ease of access, make sure you look at them at the same time, because if we make it easy for consumers to access, that could be considered a vulnerability, and you don't want to hold companies liable for easy access for the consumers when someone else uses that access to gain access to that person's data. So just balancing those issues, I think, is going to be very important going forward.
Thank you. I believe that was a comment and not a question, which is perfectly fine. But okay, thank you. Just to know if I had to react or not. It's very interesting. All right. So, guys, I think that and girls, I think that we have come almost to the end. It's 5 minutes. I just want to make a quick round to see if there is any final question or point. Yes, there is. People are hating you right now. You should know that. Please, go ahead.
Back of the room.
Yeah.
Tricia Paulette at Harris Wilcher Granis. With 5G being focused on one of the 5 key sectors, if you could explain a little bit where the Commission is coming from, since both in 3GPP, there's a lot of standardization work already underway, and of course there's European entities actively involved there, as well as in ETSI. So what more does the Commission feel it needs to provide direction on in the industry?
I think that what we believe is necessary in the 5G field is because nobody, to be quite frank, can define today what 5G is. Everybody knows 5G is this kind of umbrella term which is including a lot of different either existing or soon to be rolled out technologies and many different layers of the stack. From the access layer, wireless access layer, but also the application layer, the underlying security protocols that will be used, and so on and so forth. And that makes makes standardization difficulties. I think one point on which we all agree is that it would be unfortunate to have fragmented standards at the global level that would be damaging for industry, because it would be more difficult for them to roll out or recoup their considerable investments all across the world, whether that's the telcos, the equipment manufacturer, the software developers, it doesn't matter. So we believe there is a need for coordinated approach to standardization activities. The way in which we want to do that, we leave it up. We are ready to discuss what's the best way to do that. We think there is a role for public authorities to kind of steer in that direction, but we accept that others, in particular in the US, seem to have a different opinion on that. Secondly, we think it's very, very important that we see 5G not so much as a purely network standardization issue, because there is that issue. It's about network technology, but 5G, the way we understand it, the way industry has been telling us we should be looking at it, is very much also about the interaction within this networking layer and the application layer, the verticals, as some people call them. Where it's about smart transportation, where you will have, for example, very low latency to have autonomous cars, which might or might not be smart. We'll see when the time comes. You need to have a very low latency network communication between the cars, because they have to react very quickly to any signal that they receive from another car, and so on and so forth. So whereas in the transportation sector, in the health sector, you have all these different verticals. What we believe is that there hasn't been enough discussion, and that's one of the things we facilitate through our 5G public-private partnership. There hasn't been enough discussion between the kind of traditional telco/equipment sector, which is moving towards 5G, and the verticals, the industries in those verticals. And we are a bit afraid that this might lead 1, 2, 3 years down the road to issues, because the problems that if you are not clear on what the problems or the challenges or the needs of the verticals are, and on the other hand, what you can actually achieve in a reasonable time frame at the network infrastructure layer, then you're bound to have problems. So for us, it's really a matter of ensuring that the right people are sitting together and talking to each other. We had, as you know very well, Tricia, we had plenty of conversation here in the US. Many here in the US seem to believe, or not many, but at least some seem to believe that everything is fine and people are talking to each other. I must say we receive different signals from other parts of the industry who do not seem to be, they do not seem to find it doesn't seem to be so easy for them to find the right interlocutors between the verticals and the network operators/equipment manufacturers. But that's our main concern. It's not about imposing. I shouldn't have to say that, but I would say it anyway. It's not about imposing European standards on this. We didn't do it before. I think there is a risk. We had to be a bit careful that if we don't talk between the US and Europe enough, some other big country out there might ultimately impose its own standards on us. And I'm not sure that would be on our industries, and I'm not sure that would be particularly beneficial for either of us. But I think I'll stop here on this particular issue, if you're all right. So I think nobody now wants to stand between you and the lunch or whatever you want to do. Let me just say a few points of order to close. Thank you very much for your patience. I know this was a very, very long presentation. You've been an excellent public. I love you all. I hope that it was clear enough. The slides, the one thing I'll do, I will go over the slides also on the basis of the question you asked me to see if there was some point that needs to be clarified. But those slides have been clear with Brussels, so I will distribute them to the participants. One thing that I would like to ask you, this meeting was on record, which is fine. There might be press in the room, which is also fine, but please be cognizant and aware of the fact I went over, I lost count of the number of directives and regulations and communications. It's a very complex strategy with a lot of different moving pieces. So what I'm getting at is, before you quote me on any of this, especially the press, I would very much like to have a chat with you just to make sure that I didn't say something by mistake, which can happen. So to make sure that I can get you the proper information, and then I don't have to spend 1 week with Brussels explaining why somebody quoted me on Politico, etc., in ways that I shouldn't have been quoted, which has happened. On this note, thank you so much for coming. It's been a great pleasure for me and for everybody at the delegation. I want to thank again Jolie McPhee and the Internet Society New York chapter for their support in the webcast. Thank you to all of those who follow us via the webcast, and thank you all, and I hope I'll see you soon. Thanks. You do have an office in Brussels, I think. Who's working in Brussels?
Nicholas and Benjamin King.
I'm not sure I met them, but I'm sure they are in full contact with them.